Shabbat Shalom. In 2021, I had the great privilege of having an adventure when my mom and I took the Greyhound bus from Missoula, Montana, up to Whitefish, Montana, and boarded an Amtrak train for a 24-hour train trip to Minneapolis, Minnesota. We took a tiny sleeping car, a phrase I use somewhat loosely. It was about as big as this podium. And at night, when the person designated for the upper berth, which was me, climbed the rope ladder to tuck into the little cot that came a little down from the ceiling, the distinct impression I had of myself was feeling like a spoon tucked into a drawer. Once there, you couldn't move. And as the train rolled through the night on those 100-year-old tracks, there wasn't much sleep to be had. Earlier that afternoon, we had left the great state of Montana, which is a lot bigger than you might think it is, fourth biggest state in the country by land mass, and entered into North Dakota. It was certainly my first time in North Dakota, and from the train, there is precious little to see. As the train rolled through the night, we stopped a couple of times, and since I certainly was not sleeping, I was able to peek out the tiny window at the sleepy North Dakota towns where the train stopped. It's a side of America that I had not seen before, and in the dead of night, it was really quite eerie. I wondered about this vast land, this enormous swath of land that is the United States, thought about how apparently empty a lot of it is, and as a side note, how we might do better in sharing it a little. But I was thinking about North Dakota because I learned very recently that North Dakota has the second fewest number of Jews in the United States by the last census. The state with the fewest Jews is South Dakota. North Dakota, by last count, had only a few hundred Jews in the state, might be a little more now. But they're not the first Jews to come to North Dakota. This week's Parsha speaks about entering a land that is new, settling in it, taking some of the first fruits of the soil which you harvest from the land, putting them in a basket, and going to give one's declaration of gratitude. The ceremony of the first fruits is an iconic moment in Jewish history to teach us humility, patience, and gratitude. And later in our Parsha, we learned about setting up stones, large stones coated with plaster, with upon them an inscription of the words of this Torah. That was all in the first section today. Jews have been farmers and harvesters for a very long time. And there's evidence of that in North Dakota, roughly 3 miles east of the well-named village of Starkweather. In a small patch of unfenced land under a boundless sky, there is a handful of tombstones. In his book Badlands, travel writer Jonathan Rabin wonders about the impact these vast and often violent lands had on the settlers who believed that America promised them a kind of redemption, the way that the promised land in our Torah was and still is for the Jewish people. But the names on these little grave markers are not Norwegian, the original home of most of the settlers of North Dakota. Their names instead are names like Joseph Cantor, Mandel Hill, Joseph Edelman, and Israel Greenberg. Yes, there were Jewish settlers in North Dakota. These gravestones all date from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the relatively few Jewish immigrants that set out on the adventure far beyond the great majority that settled in New York, several thousand found their way to the Great Plains, staking claim to 160 acres that each of them was given, with the promise that after 5 years of backbreaking labor, the land would become theirs. It was described as an alien, heathen land, harsh and bare and hostile. Sophie Troupin describes this sense of imaginative disconnect in her austere memoir, Dakota Diaspora, Memoirs of a Jewish Homesteader. She remembers that soon after landing in the United States with her family, she began to hear a mysterious word. They were bound for a place called North Dakota, and it was there that our traveling would come to an end. We had no idea what it would be like, but whatever it was, we would finally rest in this promised land. But they had little time to rest. They had barely escaped the densely populated world of the ghetto, which at least was marked by shared religious and cultural traditions, but racked by spasms of anti-Semitic violence, for a world free, they hoped, not just of anti-Semitism, but it was free of most everything else they had associated with normal life. The material conditions of the immigrants in the northern fringes of North Dakota often resembled the material conditions of immigrants in the Lower East Side. Privacy was a rare commodity, as was indoor plumbing. The Troupins trekked to the wells at the foot of the hill upon which our house stood. Others had to move shanties to accompany the wells they had to dig. Heating in the winter was dicey in both urban and rural settings, and families often depended upon the heat generated by bodies snuggling close together to survive cold nights. The intensity of labor was similar in both worlds. Immigrants were trapped in the infamous sweatshops of New York Lower East Side. They were also forced to work 15-hour days and nights, not unlike the unrelenting labor of the men who tilled the Dakotan soil. It seems to me, as I look back, Sophie Troupin wrote, all the rows and heaps of rocks that lay along each cleared field were stained with the sweat of zealots. There were so many other dangers for these Jewish settlers on the Great Plains. Most of them didn't make it through the first 5 years. If they lived, they gave up and went back to urban centers. But new waves of immigrants continued to spill into North Dakota with help of immigrant aid societies. Some were more resilient than others, some of the towns. Near the town of Devil's Lake, the number of Jewish homesteads grew from 10 to more than 40 by 1889. They actually had their own post office that the settlers named Ben Sion. The name was proposed by its first and last postmaster, Benjamin Greenberg, who believed the settlement was a new Zion. At first, his hopes didn't seem utterly utopian. By the end of the decade, settlers were cultivating about 3,500 acres of wheat and flax fields. But the crop wasn't enough to cover the bills or pay back the earlier loans, which were often tied to very high interest rates. Like its sister communities, the Devil's Lake settlement faded and disappeared. And the trace they left is ghostly. A 1965 census revealed that only 3 of nearly 50,000 households in rural North Dakota had even a smidgen of Jewish ancestry. There is a book by Rebecca Bender called Still. She is the descendant of a Russian Jewish immigrant turned first-time farmer on the Dakota Plains. And her book is called Still because she was asked by a reporter learning her Dakotan heritage if she was still Jewish. In promoting her book, which came out just a few years ago, she found that people were very curious about the Jewish history of the Great Plains. And she, which was partly why I yet again decide that God is mysterious, she is part of a community that set up 2 giant stones near one of these North Dakotan cemeteries with plaques to recall the Jews that passed through there and homesteaded there. So I'd already been reading about the North Dakotan Jews and then coming back to the Parsha and reminding myself that the Israelites are commanded to set up stones to tell their story. Well, I got a little chill in a good way. She's been encountering in the few years of promoting her book some not unexpected stereotypes about Jewish people. Among them, she's been asked, Jews haven't served much in their country's military, have they? She reminds everyone that in World War II, 550,000 Jews served in the armed forces of the United States at a higher percentage than general population. She's asked, Jews tend to stick to themselves in their communities, right? She has many instances from her family's lore about the back and forth between the Jews and their German-Russian neighborhoods, their neighbors in this what they call the sauerkraut triangle. Today there are a number of Sarahs, she says, still walking around who were named after her great-grandaunt, who was proficient in Russian, English, German, and Yiddish, and translated for the doctors while her rural neighbors were giving birth. And then, one that is addressed particularly by this week's Parsha, she's often asked, Jews weren't very good farmers, were they? Well, she says, some European Jews, of course, didn't farm because they weren't allowed to own land, and many Jews who farmed near Ashley, North Dakota, where her family settled, only arrived in America once the best land had been taken. But many were successful enough in the rock-filled hills of what their neighbors called Judenberg to purchase their land outright, actually, after 2 to 3 years. So some didn't wait the full 5 years to get a land title under the terms of the Homestead Act, which will celebrate its 100th anniversary very soon. So with these notes in mind, it does us well to sometimes look at a vast and seemingly empty place and remember that there probably have been people living on it, trying to make a living on it for a very long time. In some places, we'd be surprised, I think, to find that Jewish people have tried to stake their claim, finding a promised land in an alien, heathen, barren land, the Badlands, as the Dakotas are known. I was thinking, though, what it might meant to these settlers when they wrestled some kind of produce out of the land, and as we know, a number of them did. What it was like for them to experience their first fruits. Did they have a ceremony? Was their gratitude deep? I imagine they did, and I imagine it was. If we might find ourselves one day, as well we might, wandering to a new land, trying to wring our survival from a hostile earth with our bare hands, will we too be sufficiently grateful? Can we leave enough of a mark that our ancestors will erect stones to that memory? Will they be proud of us? I certainly hope that they will be. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.